Dead up. Good morning. So, my name is Mark. Einstein used to teach undergraduate physics at Princeton University. His second-year students, when they went into the examination hall, would get a little bit of a shock, because when they sat down in the examination hall as second-year students, in front of them would be last year's examination questions. The undergraduate students would then finally put up their hand and say, "Excuse me, Einstein, you seem to have made a mistake. You seem to have given us last year's questions." Well, Einstein would just smile and say, "Well, whilst it's true that I'm giving you last year's questions this year, the answers are all different." What is very interesting then, if you look at entrepreneurship, changing the world and everything else, we're living in a fantastic time when this year the answers are all different. So we're looking at what we'll be talking about today is almost a sort of phenomenal transformation of sort of humankind, about with the tools that we have, the new spirit that exists, to really make change at a profound and a dramatic stage. So my name is Mark. I am, in case you're trying to wonder where my accent is from, I was born in Canada. I have South African parents. I grew up in England. For the last 10 years, I've been half in the United States, Boston, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and half based out of Berlin, Paris, London. I get bored very easily. So, and I do all kinds of different things. We'll talk about dictatorships. I also have a fashion photography studio in Los Angeles. Without having any background in fashion, with no background in photography, and also not living in Los Angeles. And I'll explain why that is. I've done technology beforehand. What I'm going to do for today is that I'm going to take you through a sort of notion of sort of connecting the dots to give you a new lens of how to look at the world. And before I go into this thing, this will be an interactive discussion. So any question at any time, we will take this. We won't just take questions at the end. And I urge you all, as you start working on sort of thinking through this, that if you do have a question, sort of already start writing it down, so we can make this into a dialogue or into a discussion. I, of course, have already lost the clicker. Where did it go to? I might lose my cloud. There it is. Okay. I am an idiot. Actually, my goal is to be an idiot. I will not achieve that goal, but my goal is to be an idiot and to be a sort of Forrest Gump of simplicity. What I do, I've got two main areas that I work on. One is called spread design. So where my expertise now lies is in the ability to craft programs to design how you spread things, how you spread ideas, how you spread companies, how you spread behavioral change, how you spread products, how you spread services, and also how do you stop spread from happening. So this looks at the whole world of contagion. So this is my academic background, and I will be teaching you some of the science of spread as we go through to give you some help that you have as entrepreneurs in your business or working in companies to achieve things. I also do something called extreme problem solving. Extreme problem solving are the impossible problems. And one of the reasons why I like impossible problems is that when you achieve the impossible, you change the boundaries of what is possible. So going after the hardest problems in the world is personally quite fun, it's quite challenging, but what it does is now going to change our minds about what is actually possible in this world. And to start off with extreme problem solving, I should mention my personal goal is to change the entire world for better. All of it at the same time. I am not an idealist. I'm a practical person. I might have an idealistic goal, but even then it's not an idealistic goal, it's a practical goal. In order to come up with a practical goal, I then worked out, well, if my goal and challenge is to change the entire world for better, I need to work out a plan to go do this thing. In 2007, I found out that the work that I'd done at my first company, Imaginatic, which was around collective intelligence, I was given an award of Technology Pioneer by the World Economic Forum. This is the group that do the events at Davos, and my life's ambition of going to Davos and being a participant was about to be fulfilled. This was when I decided that, well, what I really wanted to do was change the entire world for better. I needed to have a plan, and I spent some months working out a plan. When I got to Davos, I then realized, well, people think that I'm mad. That's not very good. I mean, kind of handy to some extent if people think you're crazy because you can push a little bit further. But ultimately, you don't actually want people to think you're mad. So I thought, you know what I need? I need a test. I will now take you through a test of working to help bring down a dictator as a test and experiment that worked. This is the Zimbabwean election in 2008. Robert Mugabe there has been a dictator for 36 plus years, and an election was going to be fought in 2008. Miraculously, he lost the election. But it wasn't miraculously. People tell me sometimes, well, okay, you're so lucky. Being lucky is when you win the lottery and you didn't buy a ticket. So there wasn't really any miracles. This stuff was designed. What happened, the result here was that Robert Mugabe lost the election, the first round of the election, by 50.4%. And this was unheard of because he cheated the election. It was fraud. The reason why he lost was a little activity that was done. So here is a newspaper report that came out just as the election was finishing from a group of activists. This group of activists had managed to get a database of 35% of the total vote in Zimbabwe and were able to prove with physical evidence that the opposition was winning by 66% and Mugabe had lost. What actually happened was that at 7 o'clock in the morning at Davos, I meet a guy in the shuttle bus. I wanted a test for my Change the World plans. And he said, well, okay, let's have a chat at 10 o'clock when you're slightly less hungover. It's party stuff. Let's have a chat, and then I'll tell you my problem. This man is the Deputy Prime Minister of Zimbabwe now. But at the time, he was just an opposition politician. And he said, look, Mark, here's my problem. We'll be fighting an election in Zimbabwe in 5 weeks' time. I have no money. And I can't tell anybody what I'm doing because you go to jail or you get killed. And this includes Morgan Tsvangirai, the boss of the party. Can you possibly come up with a plan to help apply your techniques of whatever, crowdsourcing, collective intelligence, to defeat a dictator in a corrupt election? One of the things that I've done is that I've created a set of rules in my head. And one of those rules is, it's all easy. Very simple rule, which means that if ever you're doing anything hard and it doesn't work, you go back to the first rule, is that it's all easy. So, and I'll talk about these rules and heuristics as I go through the model a little bit later, but so now I'm sitting down, this guy says, I'm fighting an election, I have no money and I can't tell anybody about it. Can you help? First response, oh God, you want to do what? And then afterwards, okay, it's all easy, in that case we can do this. We spent 45 minutes discussing, and we came up with a plan that worked. Our plan was, I asked him the question, so it was, how is the election going to be stolen? So the normal ways that elections are stolen is you invent the results at the back end. So you actually don't care particularly, you allow people to vote normally, and in that particular case, they were just going to basically sort of change the final results. I applied some of the rules and the techniques. So one of the rules is transparency. And there's usually within all systems a moment when things become open, things become clear. Because it turned out that as part of their election protocol, so that the people in Zimbabwe knew they weren't being cheated locally, they actually ran the elections honestly at local level. And then they put the honest election results on the front door of the polling stations for about 30 minutes to an hour, so that the local people could see that there was honesty. So now I came up with the idea of what would be called crowdsourced election monitoring. But wouldn't it be great, there were 4,000 polling stations, wouldn't it be great if we could persuade 1,000 people with camera phones to stand outside the polling stations? Wouldn't it be great, we have to assume though, that at least one of these people is working for the bad guys. So what we should do in building a fault-tolerant system is we should assume one person's working for the bad guys, and therefore we should not tell anybody what they're going to go do. So in fact, 1,000 people agreed to help, but they didn't know why or what. Part of the other reason for that is that if you're about to do something bad, you will be nervous, you will be stressed, you will sweat, which means you'll get arrested, you'll get beaten up, or you could get killed. So we have a responsibility when we're doing these things to help think about human lives. So these 1,000 people had actually received a text message to say, would you be willing to help do something? Please bring your camera phone and stand next to the polls across Zimbabwe. When the polls closed and the results came out, they received a text message, a new text message. Please can you take a picture of your local result? 1,000 people go click at the same time. If you'd like the analogy of that, how many of you have seen the James Bond movie Quantum of Solace? A few people? So there is a moment in Quantum of Solace where they're at an opera, and he manages to get hold of some mobile phone, and he's able to then sort of pretty much sort of get the bad guys to all stand up at the same time. And they were scattered around. But because the single message came out at the same time, a group of people synchronized to do exactly the same thing at exactly the same time in basically a microsecond. Well, this tactic was used for Zimbabwe. I tend to use things like movies and history for analogs to come up with plans. And so these 1,000 people went click and took a picture. That picture went to a website in South Africa where 10 students were waiting to turn the pictures into a spreadsheet. And after about 3.5 hours of counting the pictures and making sure that the pictures weren't blurry and making sure that the numbers were typed in correctly, they'd counted 35% of the total possible vote in Zimbabwe and put out a global press release to say that an anonymous group of freedom fighters had counted 35% of the total vote in Zimbabwe. The opposition was winning by 66% and Robert Mugabe had lost. That took 10 hours to plan, design, and execute, and cost no money. When we look at the sort of Einstein thing this year, the answers are all different. We live at an incredible time for technology, attitude, spirit, where right now this year the answers are all different. And this was, by the way, a test. Now, also, if we mention sort of the failure stuff, and by the way, I always thoroughly recommend don't talk about failure, because failure is a negative word. We'd like setbacks. We just have setbacks. We don't actually fail. So I had a setback with the Zimbabwe thing. This had never been done, and it turns out if we'd have had 1,300 people with camera phones, we would have counted enough of the vote to stop Mugabe winning full stop. But we thought 1,000 was about right, so we got our math wrong. These things happen. And we also didn't understand contagion. This is about how do you roll a whole system. So this, though, as a pilot, was a pretty successful pilot to work out, well, can you actually, with these techniques and methods, make a change at very, very large scale that actually works? And the answer was yes. And so we'll talk as we go on about how to scale that. What actually happens then, to understand what's going on, is we need a new lens. In 1660, there was a crazy Dutch scientist called Anton van Leeuwenhoek. And van Leeuwenhoek was completely and utterly mad. He spent 10 years of his life writing scientific papers about how he saw small things moving around in water. And clearly the man was mad, because if you look at a glass of water with the naked eye, you can't see anything. Finally, the Royal Society, which had just been created in London, this group of very prestigious scientists came to visit this man at his laboratory in Holland. And it turns out that this man had invented the microscope. The small things had always been there, but we as human beings lacked the eyes, we lacked the lens to see it. The stuff was always there. What I think fundamentally now is taking place, and I've been sort of spending the last 3 years very, very intensively, is creating a human microscope. Can we begin to understand what is actually going on so we can look at this crazy world of Arab Springs, 800 million people on a Facebook application that's basically the whole population of the US and Europe on a single app within a small number of years? How do we have a new lens to understand what the hell is going on in this weird world? So how do we understand it? How can we then use this new lens to help us predict what is likely to happen next? And then that third thing as well, and I'll be teaching you some of these techniques, and if anybody has any questions again the way through, we can go into them. So then how do we use this to design change programs? Because a lot of these things, they don't happen. There is a form of design that you can have to spread things and make change. Because if we look at it, the world has changed dramatically. So I'm now doing work on contagion, sort of how things spread. Now, I have 2 little children. So I have a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old, 2 sons. They'll be better than daddy. But if you have kids, they can be quite difficult to control. It's a little bit like herding cats sometimes. In fact, if you have boy children are powered by testosterone. Males have 10 times more testosterone, between 10 and 100 times more testosterone than women. But in the little boy, in the little toddler boy, the impact of testosterone is that it can switch off the auditory processing system. Which means that for the little boy child, when you want the little boy child to go do things, you physically have to pick the person up to move them. And this is because testosterone, when they're really interested or excited, stops their ability to hear. Tactics. If we look at that and the sort of boys and girls, so then at the age of 6 weeks old, the little boy brain and the little girl brain is pretty much the same. At just after 6 weeks, though, if you look at how both babies then look at their mothers, there is a fundamental change that occurs. At the beginning, you have the sort of look at mother, and mother smiles or frowns, the baby is responding. After 6 weeks, the little girl will continue like that, to look at nuances, faces, sort of really sort of pick things up. Little boys, they like things that move and things that go bang. So now what's interesting then is that if you want the boy to be excited, you pretty much have things that move, things that go bang, things that cars, because they're biologically programmed through their neurochemistry to like stuff that moves. So these then begin to become some fundamental things, and I will be talking about how important this stuff is when you are looking at change programs, because understanding of what's sitting inside of our head is very important, very interesting. The reason why I mentioned my son and looking at changing the world, when he was 5 years old, he came in after bedtime to say, excuse me, Daddy. Now, normally, my partner, Yvonne, she would say, go back to bed right now. I, however, have realized that it's so much easier not to have an argument. So, okay, what do you want, Patrick? He says, Daddy, how do mushrooms grow? It's like 9:15 at night. How do mushrooms grow? Okay, well, I actually don't know. So I'll tell you what, let's get out the iPhone, or the iPad, got both, and let's type in mushrooms, and it'll pop up the Wikipedia page. Let's go into YouTube and look at a video of how mushrooms grow. And in 6 or 7 minutes, now he knows how mushrooms grow, and then he goes to bed happy. I'm from Canada. When we moved to England in 1975, my parents didn't have that much money, but we did have the Encyclopedia Britannica. So the Encyclopedia Britannica would be these big books that you get, and you'll have had your equivalent over here, which is an encyclopedia, book A, B, C, D. If your family didn't have that much money, the way that you used to buy encyclopedias was you'd buy it in installments. Can you imagine how crazy the world would be if you didn't have access to words starting with the letter M? That is how the world used to work, not even just 20 years ago. If you didn't have enough money, you had no access to mushrooms. Because if you've only paid for half of the sort of the dictionary or half of the encyclopedia, you don't have access. And yet now somebody over Wi-Fi on a gadget is able to find out the videos and everything else. Now, I also like this because this is the inspiration for contagion, but I'll talk about the contagion earlier. But mushrooms then gives you an example. Another example. My two kids, they like Top Gear. How many of you watch Top Gear or know what Top Gear is? Very popular here. So my kids like Top Gear, and so sometimes when they're brushing their teeth, they want to be distracted. And they said, Daddy, we want to see the Top Gear tractor race. When I moved to England in 1975, I was 5 years old, in England they had 3 television channels. And if you wanted to watch Top Gear at the time, I'm sort of a little bit later, Top Gear would be on, let's say, on a Thursday on BBC 2 at 8 o'clock. And if you missed it, you could never see it again in the history of mankind. Now, you pretty much go into a web browser, type in the name, and out it pops. The whole world is completely and utterly changing, and we're only just beginning to start understanding this. Final example here, there is the MIT OpenCourseware, and Stanford have just got an experiment as well on this. So let's say you're in Nigeria, and you're a smart 13-year-old kid and you love physics. Well, what are the odds that you're going to go to a good university to learn physics? They're pretty low. But because of the power of the internet and this sort of emergent creative platform that we've all been working on, What you have now is that somebody at MIT decided to put all of their courseware online. So now this 13-year-old bright kid can go online and for free access all of the same courseware that a Stanford student or an MIT student would get, and see the videos taught by Nobel Prize-winning scientists. What is absolutely fascinating that we as a planet are beginning to become extremely intelligent, and partially we need to be, because at the moment we're unbelievably stupid, really stupid. But as we begin to create these more connections, have access to information, we as a planet are beginning to become extremely smart, and we're about to go through a dramatic transformation, I believe, in the next 4 years, to actually see the planet become much, much more intelligent more quickly. What I'd like to do then is that I'd now like to give you a structure, give you a framework so that you can step by step, so rather than just talking about stories, to give you a framework so you can start looking at your own problems, your own business challenges you have, to see if you can sort of take advantage of this stuff. So when I came up with my plan to change the world and I was looking at the science of spread, I realized that you need to have a model that gives you 3 different levels. A level of the individual, a level of the group, and then the level of the masses. Within the individual, we're trying to work out what's going on in our heads. And I'm deliberately separating out, I found, the difference between an individual and an individual in a group setting. Because actually, what happens is that when we are sitting alone by ourselves, and we know that we're not being watched, we behave differently to when we're in a whole group of people. All you have to do is just flash back to your mind, okay, yeah, you will probably quite happily admit that you do behave differently when you're by yourself than with others. There are certain things you would never do around other people. Or maybe you would do, but only if you're really drunk. And then there are groups. So how do people work with group dynamics? And then there is the masses. How do behaviors change when you scale it to the area of sort of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of people? Now, these tactics, by the way, will help explain the Arab Spring. It'll help explain Facebook. It'll help explain a number of these things that are allowing sort of things to spread. And I'll be teaching them. When we look at the individual, we're going to be talking about neuroscience, and we're going to talk about behavioral science. What is interesting, if one, let's say, looks at psychology, many of you will know sort of Freudian psychology. Freudian psychology is total and complete crap. There's not a single piece of goodness in it. And part of the reason is that it's a non-validated theory. You see a horse and you imagine that you want to have sex with your mother. Okay, prove it. There is no proof. And I think then right now, as we begin to adopt at least the scientific method, okay, you've made a guess. Well, let's find a way of testing to see if your guess is right. If it is right, we can scale it and copy it. And if it is wrong, we will discount that theory and develop a new theory to explain it. What's interesting with behavioral science and behavioral psychology is that rather than relying on guesswork, people are conducting experiments. We could, for example, put a 10-euro note on the floor and say, well, okay, when will it be picked up? And we may think it's going to be picked up immediately. We may think, no, it's going to take a little while. But now we can watch as people go by. We can then get some results, and we begin to interpret those results. It's applying the scientific method to psychology, what's going on inside our heads. And then in the same way with neuroscience. Neuroscience has gone dramatically. If we look at what's going on inside of our brains, because people did lobotomies for a fairly decent period of time, a lot of the science of brain studies was pretty much sort of humiliated and disregarded. It's only in the last 10 or 15 years with MRI machines, magnetic resonance imaging machines, that we're able to see brain flows in our head. And this allows us now to do those same psychological experiments and then to actually get results. For example, if you look at free will, are we able to have our own free will? Free will lives here, sitting at the back. And the reason why we know this is that there's a fairly classic experiment where you put individuals into these MRI machines and you ask them in turn to lift up a finger, lift up middle finger, next finger. So then there is an accurate brain map about how people are lifting up their fingers. So now we know the piece of the sort of motor functions in their brain, how they're processing the auditory instructions. But now you say, well, okay, you can lift up any finger that you want. And what happens about 20 milliseconds before the other activity, there's a piece of the brain that flashes up here that determines which finger that they will lift up. There is actually a little piece of our brains that pretty much is our self-will, our free will engine. And we can see it because we've got the brain flows. There's one of my friends has got a sort of brain science company called Emotive. And they do sort of $200 ECG machines. And if you do yoga or meditation, they're really quite handy. Because if you're trying to impact your brain to feel connected with the planet, part of your problem is that you don't have any reference point about whether you're thinking in the right place. With this machine, you can work out, if you want to have the feeling of being connected with the whole universe, that lives here, which is our brain map and structure about where our bodies end. So what you do for those people that have gone through lots of meditation is they just focus on this little bit here. Science. Science is good. So that's the individual. But then we're going to look at groups, how people behave with others. And there's some really, really weird, spooky effects that we'll go into with groups that we'll do together. And then the final thing is the masses. And when we look at the masses, we're looking at complex systems. We're looking at networks. We're looking at abundance. We're looking at how spooky the world gets when you have large numbers of people. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of step through each one of these areas. And I'm going to start off with the brain, and I'm going to start off with neuroscience. By the way, let's see, it's a tricky one. Who would like to know the neurochemistry and neuroscience of sex? Okay. And by the way, this doesn't mean actually having sex and demonstrating. I could tell. So, and that includes by yourself. This is being videoed, isn't it? So, neurochemistry of sex. This is very, very important stuff. So if you look at sex, there are sort of 3 basic neurotransmitters that are given off, and there's an extra one that men have. So there's dopamine, there is serotonin, and there is oxytocin, and males have vasopressin. So if you look at the basic functioning of these things, dopamine is the pleasure high. And we are actually totally driven by dopamine. Dopamine is the thing that says, oh, I'd like to have a can of Red Bull now. Dopamine creates an expectation in your head, I want one of these things. And then you get to go do it, you get your little pleasure high. Dopamine. Dopamine is one of the key drivers that we have. And you get dopamine from sex. Next one is serotonin. Serotonin is the feeling of serenity, the feeling of grace. Fantastic, serotonin. Also a good one. And then you have oxytocin. Oxytocin is the bonding agent. Oxytocin is the cuddle sort of hormone. So oxytocin is what sort of bonds us together and makes us want to connect. Men have got vasopressin as well, and vasopressin is the protectiveness hormone. The thing that says, if you approach my woman right now, I'll bash you over the head with a club. Nothing. Men have that vasopressin. Oh, by the way, just another thing for men and women in here. A woman's brain changes between every 5 and 60 minutes. Always. Men don't change that much. And part of the reason for this is the changing hormonal balance of estrogen, progesterone, a bit of testosterone. And because that balance is always changing, this means that really sort of from a male perspective, if your partner or girl is sort of gets all of a sudden really, really angry, wait for an hour. Wait for it. It's just the way that it works. Let's just go actually back to the neurochemistry of sex. This is important stuff. So now when you look at having sex with a partner, then you've got this sort of oxytocin, this bonding agent. One of the things that happens when you keep having sex with the same partner over and over again is that oxytocin builds up. Not only does it build up, but it needs to be maintained and topped up. And part of the reason then, if you're not sort of physically close to the other person, is then after a while you realize, why the hell am I with this bozo? So it needs to be topped up. There is a downside of the buildup of oxytocin. With the buildup of oxytocin, you lose the highs of dopamine and serotonin. It's just not as fun anymore. This is, by the way, if you've been in a relationship between 5, 8, and 10 years, you are right, it's not as fun anymore. Now, what's also interesting with oxytocin is that, let us say that we were constantly bonded with the first person that we partnered with. And they accidentally, I don't know, got killed by a saber-toothed tiger. Or they died in childbirth, which is a sort of more normal thing. Well, if we were constantly bonded to the same person, this isn't really sort of almost good for the survival of the species. So actually, oxytocin has got a really interesting impact, and I think most men in here certainly will probably have some experience of this. What oxytocin also does is it has a memory erasing function. So the next time you have a brand new partner, what oxytocin does is it helps erase the traces of the previous person you were connected with. Handy stuff. Now, by the way, these things will become important when we start talking about the masses and the connection and also complex systems. Because actually one of the things that we want to do as human beings and sort of almost everything is connect. We have this desire to bond, and it's fundamental whether you're looking at electrons and atoms, whether you're looking at sort of gravitational mass pulling things together. We as human beings, in fact, I actually personally don't believe that right now the purpose of life is to procreate or even sex. Because to be honest, as human beings, as a species, if our goal was to procreate, we're unbelievably bad at it. Because if you look at how many people there are, and how many times they have sex, and how many times they have babies, we're just really useless. The percentage is like sort of a fraction of a percent. In all likelihood, the real reason we are really driven is our desire to bond. Part of this is that as we are growing up as a small child, we get cuddled and stroked and nurtured. We actually quite like it. You get a whole bunch of oxytocin buzz and everything else. So I actually believe that most of the time, the thing that drives us is the desire for intimacy and the desire to have a cuddle. But then if you're going to cuddle somebody that's nice, well, one thing leads to another. So it's more of an accidental byproduct. If we then look at a practical thing, I always go for sort of having practical help and advice. What happens if your partner is upset? Inside of our heads, we have two systems to help us sort of handle upset. We have what's called a mirror neuron system, and mirror neurons are extremely important. We'll discuss them sort of later. Mirror neurons, and the other system is called, let's call it the TPS system, transperineal something or other. I'm not very good with names. So what happens then is that let's say that you are crying, and your partner is then looking at you, and what are you crying? Mirror neurons allow us to observe what is going on, and then mirror inside of our heads the same response. I see you crying. In my head, I understand what crying is like. I see people running and jumping. I understand in my head what running and jumping is like. Well, we also, both men and women, but men have got a much stronger one, have got the TPS system. The TPS system is also known as Mr. Fix-It. So now what happens is that you're crying. You may want empathy. The man says, okay, I see you crying. I feel that. Hang on for a second. But I can fix this. So just tell me what your problem is, and I'll work out a way of fixing it. So they look up in the sky like, yeah, tell me more. They did this. Yeah, they did this. Yeah, I know that bit's irrelevant. Look, I've got a plan, and I fixed it, and I'm really happy. Now, what's interesting also then is the woman has got her mirror neurons going into it. And as she observes, or as you observe your partner basically not paying any attention to you any longer, you now think that there's no connection and bonding, where the guy's actually quite happy. Look, I'm just fixing your problem for you. These things are important. It works in business. So if you're trying to have a discussion with somebody, understanding that these sort of are this is just how our brain works. These things become important in our personal relationships. But then as we go into the world of complex systems, this will also start highlighting some of the spooky stuff that is going on about how we behave as individuals. Let's move to the group setting and go into this notion of signals. Right now, we give off signals. Fundamentally, we give off signals, we pick up signals, and we determine a response. Let's just do a quick test here. Okay. So, what is very interesting here? By the way, did anybody, when you came into this room, get an instruction manual on how to use this room? No. Okay, so nobody's been sort of told, okay, we're going to go and do this. What happened is then I gave off a signal, a clap. Now, the response to that was actually relatively uncertain. So this would actually be a sort of a pickup response. There weren't lots of people clapping. There wasn't a rhythm. And sometimes when I do this, there's no clapping whatsoever. What's interesting, though, is that you're looking at basically the propagation of a signal, which can either propagate fully, or it can actually not propagate at all. But both of those are examples of signaling and picking up of signal behavior. We give off signals, a clap, People pick up the signals, in that case, auditory system, and then you determine how you would respond. But then because it's also a group setting, now we can work out, is the person next to me doing it? And based on that, I can decide to do the same thing. This then allows us to understand almost how complex systems work. And if I talk about complex systems in this sort of group setting, this room is a complex system. A complex system is defined by sort of elements, call them people here, who've got a memory. So you sort of remember where you were just in the last sort of second, who are interacting. And as soon as that happens, the world becomes complex. Not complicated, complex. Within complex systems, though, you end up with these strange emergent behaviors taking place. Right now, what is interesting is that you're all facing the same direction. You're all pretty much sort of at eye level where you're sitting down. And yet nobody gave you an instruction book on how to use this room, how to do these things. What is fascinating as we go into it is then there are sort of these emergent patterns of behavior that start taking place. And particularly when we see this in group contexts, what it does then is that within a group environment or working with other people, we then begin to synchronize. We begin to see what other people are doing and decide, will we do the same thing or not? If we then look at then sort of the behavioral science around some of this group pressure or the perceived group pressure, there are some very interesting things that we have when we start looking at signals. I'll go through this thing. Well, actually, because also then if we look at this thing, if we look at sort of we are complex and also some of the nature of this sort of behavioral science, it actually turns out that one of the ways that we're able to function in this very, very complicated or sort of complex world without exploding is that we use what's called simple rules or heuristic rules. So the way we're able to analyze it, remember I gave you the rule at the beginning, it's all easy. That's my rule in my head. It's a simple rule. Here are some simple rules that you all have in your heads. And there is almost like a sort of, once you see signals and decide on the response, you actually have your rules engine in your head that is determining how should you respond. So some of the basic ones, don't bump into things. Partially it's because it takes over energy. This is one of the reasons why there's not a pile of people sitting in the middle. You're all nicely spaced out. Your rule is don't bump into stuff. Very simple. Follow your peers. Follow your peers right now is to say, find out what somebody else is doing and copy it. Really, really simple. We can do that because we give off signals and we pick up signals. So I look for what other people are doing and I copy it. If in doubt, go for the one you know. This is what's called the recognition heuristic. It makes our lives much, much easier that, okay, if I have a choice between this one thing I've heard of and this thing that I haven't heard of, well, I should go for the one that I've heard of beforehand. Now, by the way, for those of you who are in business or planning your businesses, these are extremely useful rules to build into your marketing plans. For example, the rule of if in doubt, go for the one you know. One tactic that a lot of sort of good startups do is they work out, nobody knows who we are. But maybe if I get a board of advisor who everybody knows, maybe if I get a partner that everybody knows, then people will know this company. So I can basically borrow the recognition or credibility of somebody else to incorporate it into my plan. It's a tactic. Simple stuff. Keep doing what you're doing until there's a compelling reason to change. Is another very, very important plan because this explains stasis. We expend much less energy carrying on doing the same thing. So right now what this shows then is that if you want to disrupt a system, you need to find ways of creating that compelling reason to stop people doing it. For example, when I finish speaking, there will be food. And as we need 2,000 calories a day, we would like to consume some calories and get some energy. So right now, end, clap, leave, get food. A compelling reason to change. Another one here that I quite like is if something does not make sense, confabulate. Confabulate basically says make up shit. So what happens then as a behavioral effect that we have is that if we see things that we don't understand or doesn't have some logic, we will then create patterns in our head and imaginations in our head that basically help us make sense of it, even if it is completely fantastical and imaginary. Going back related to the neurochemistry of sex, I'll give you an example. So I've been writing a book in my spare time called the Zoo Bar Report. And this looks at people watching in bars. And one of the interesting things, I interviewed some American women sort of early on in my studies to find out, well, okay, sort of when you meet somebody, how do you think? And one American woman described to me how one of the things that she did and her friends do is that when they meet a guy they really like, they start playing with their first name and the guy's last name. In their head, they start thinking about, well, we could go on holiday together. I could imagine having kids together. So now they create this entire fantasy notion, which actually could become just as real as normal events. And this then gets encoded into our head. We as human beings keep on imagining stuff. We have a very powerful imagination. But because when we store these facts in our heads, our memory is extremely pliant, we can sometimes remember the stuff that we imagine and make up just as strongly as we can do with the stuff that is real. If you're a spread designer, you can play with that. If you're actually designing programs to take advantage of these things, if you understand how human beings operate and behave, you can sort of leverage some of these factors. And particularly if you also know, follow your peers. One of the very interesting things if you're looking at spread is that you don't have to persuade everybody. Sometimes you just need to persuade a small number of people because others will copy the small number of people. This actually then becomes very, very important tactics to spread things because it takes a lot of energy to change everybody. What you do, though, is deliberately target a small number of people to change. Make sure that those people that are changing are signaling their changed behavior to everybody else. And that allows a reference model for other people to go follow. So now let's talk about going from the groups to the masses. Nothing happened, by the way, nothing like that. From the groups to the masses. I'm going to start off, like, I found the answer to a single question is extremely illuminating, and I'm going to ask you all this question now. If there are 30 people in a room, what is the percentage likelihood that 2 or more people share a birthday? Have a think. So there's a percentage likelihood that out of a group of 30, 2 or more people share a birthday. So how many people think that it's less than 5%? How many people think, let's say, 5 to 10%? Okay. How many people think, let's say, 10 to 25%? 25 to 50%? And more than 50%? By the way, I have the right answer. So the actual answer is 71%. So all of those that thought that it was less than 5%, you were wrong by a factor of 10 to 20. Completely and utterly and fantastically wrong. So okay, let's just do a quick test. So my birthday is the 3rd of March. When's your birthday? 29th of April. Anybody? When is your birthday? 18th of August? Okay. Now we have a bigger group than 30. The thing, though, is that now we've got 3 people matching against 27, 4 matching against 26, 5 against 25. In our heads, we are egotistical. In our heads, we're thinking that this problem is about what are the odds of somebody matching my birthday. That's the wrong math. What we're actually looking at is the odds of any match taking place within a group of 30. And in fact, you found that mathematically, when you get to 23 people, the odds of getting a match is 50-50. There is a whole spooky world in the world of abundance, which says that as the numbers go up, the likelihood of finding a match for anything goes up dramatically. Now, I play the odds. So, I mean, this is just sort of basic math stuff. And let's go back to the Zimbabwe thing. So I've decided that I have a plan to change the entire world for better, and I'd like to have a pilot. I'd like a test site. Well, should I tell you the secret? Who would like to know the secret of getting whatever you want? That's good. Enthusiastic, right? And even you do too. Good. Okay, I'll tell you, because you're all so nice. The secret of getting whatever you want. The first thing is working out what it is that you want. Now, if you don't know what you want, that is what you want. I don't know what I want. That's fine. Or you might have something specific. I'd like to do a startup. I'm looking for a marketing team, blah, blah. So now you've got what I want. The next thing is to give yourself an internal time frame. Now, that is actually there are problems about an internal time clock. You may get upset at yourself because you haven't done it by that time, but it's not a bad way of just concentrating the mind. And the third thing, and actually the most important thing of all, is telling as many people as possible what it is that you want. And that is because when you go and tell as many people as possible, the odds are that you will find a connection or a match. So what you do then, and this is also, if we look at personality types, about a quarter of the population will be counted as helpers. Helpers like making social connections, they know quite a lot of people. So therefore, if you ask 10 people, the odds are that you will find 2 to 3 people that are helpers. And helpers may know the people to speak to. They're the wrong person themselves, but they will know somebody that can help. So right now then, if you want to get whatever you want, and please be reasonable with it, and this power is special, and don't be evil and that stuff. But so one of the ways of doing this then is just going around and telling people what you want. Going back to Zimbabwe. And going back to the sort of power of networks and follow your peers, one of the other things that we do as human beings is we like connecting with people that we have an affinity with. So like this is a network. I mean, right now you're here and you're not sitting in a supermarket, you're not doing sort of other stuff. So right now we're now a network, we've been pulled together. What happens is that when there is an affinity, these networks become concentrated, and in some cases they become super concentrated clusters. Well, what happens then in one of the tactics, so going back to, again, the Zimbabwe thing. How the hell do you get 1,000 people on the ground in Zimbabwe with camera phones following instructions and you have only 5 weeks and no money? How the hell do you do? That took 30 minutes. The tactic is called pre-existing networks. So the tactic then, and by the way, you should all be building this into your marketing plans, and that is because people have this affinity, they connect. People form networks. You exist in your university networks, your maybe community networks, so we live within networks. And one of the easiest tactics is pretty much you find a network which sort of matches where you would like to go, and you drop your message into the network, and your message propagates through the network. So rather than you going through the hassle of trying to find 1 person, 2 people, 3 people, you find a network that exists that is almost parallel to what your needs are. In the case of Zimbabwe, as I was having my somewhat hungover conversation at Davos, this was then, okay, we need 1,000 people with camera phones. What networks do you have? Do you have trade unions? Do you have teachers' unions? Do you have student unions? I mean, what do you have as groups? He goes, well, this is easy. The opposition, the MDC, have got 15,000 people who are supporters, and actually a lot of us are using text messaging to coordinate. Well, so to find 1,000 of those people willing to help took about a half an hour. Send the message out to 15,000 people, the world of abundance, and 1,000 people were able to say yes, they would help. How on earth did I get my test done? Well, the World Economic Forum of Davos is a super concentrated cluster of people that are doing some very impactful things and that would like to do even more impactful things. So what I did when I went to Davos is I spoke to 200 people to say, hi, my name is Mark. You might think I'm crazy, but I'd like to change the entire world and I need a test. Can you help? I spoke to 200 people. The 1 person that I actually spoke to and connected with properly is now the Deputy Prime Minister of Zimbabwe. Tactics, based on understanding the individuals, the group psychology, and now we're going to the masses, and this is the spookiness of large numbers. Another thing then is networks. So right now you're probably all members of LinkedIn and other things. So one of the things about networks, networks are pretty handy things. And one of the best things about networks you can then think about is called network activation. Like, how do you get your network to go do stuff? But before we talk about that, we're going to look at pretty much, first of all, some of the things about networks that most people do not think about. If we look at this room as being a network, and if you've got some email addresses, you might have a Facebook sort of group that is now set up, we're now sort of sitting in within a network. When most people think about networks, they think in a single dimension. They think of the network as being flat. And in fact, for reference, this book behind here is called Flatland, which is almost like a conceptual novel of a square who lives in a 2-dimensional world, and he meets a sphere who lives in a 3-dimensional world, and it's like pretty much sort of playing with geometry. But as a concept now, if we look at a network, most people think of networks in a single dimension. But that is wrong. It is a completely false assumption. Right now, we live in multi-dimensional networks. So every single person here will be a member of anywhere between 5 and 10 networks. Oh, another rule that I have in my head is be lazy. I'm an extremely lazy person. I like getting a lot of stuff done, but I'm really lazy. And one of the ways that I'm lazy is I use tactics like this to work out how can you do things at a huge scale to have an impact. So right now, then, if you'd like a large number of people to go do things, you find your network, but you assume that everybody in that network is massively multidimensional. They'll exist in other networks. And so what you do, let's say you're doing something as simple as your marketing communication blast. What you do for every message that you put out is you include what's called a viral spread. If you've got this, can you please share this with 10 other people or a network that you belong to? And what you do then at a world of scale and abundance is that if you send your communication out to 1,000 people, about between 100 and 150 will share it. And if you explicitly give them the anchor to drive them to say, please share it into their network, then some people will be sharing it in their Facebook network or their LinkedIn. And now all of a sudden, with that first communication of 1,000, you can actually reach out to 100,000. Tactics, lazy stuff. By the way, I will also tell you, if people are interested, the story of the activity that I've done on Gaddafi in Libya, because there's some other very simple tactics on that. But I will just finish off on the network piece. This then goes into the pre-existing network. Remember the Zimbabwe story. The easiest way to get 1,000 people on the ground in Zimbabwe is find 1,000 people who are already there that already have phones. So the notion of tapping into pre-existing networks is critically important. I'll use that as a way of describing some of the work that was done in Libya. So I've been part of a group of citizen activists who have been strategists and extreme problem solvers around the Libyan revolution. Let's just do a little. So, I mean, right now I do technology, but fashion photography. How on earth can an individual have the telephone numbers and email addresses of the National Transitional Council when very few people even knew their names? When the spies and the millions of pounds of military hardware investment weren't able to get anything? Let's go back. Story of Libya. So on the 25th of February, I get a contact from a woman called Stephanie. Stephanie is 37 years old. She has 2 kids from different daddies. She doesn't really care. She's fine. Scorpio. They're always quite fun. She used to sell Prada shoes, so she was the store manager for Prada in Paris for 15 years. She lost her job at Prada and had spent a year doing social media marketing for restaurants. When the Egyptian revolution was starting, and there was the Facebook revolution, she decided to show her 9-year-old daughter sort of, this is what mummy is doing now. And she was looking online on the internet and seeing the Facebook thing. Well, at the same time then, the Feb 17 movement was then starting in Libya. And so she was on Twitter, and then she came across a website called Feb 17 Livestream. So this was a live stream chat. She then got to know the people in this live stream, and this was Mohammed Nabuz, who was a techie. He had a webcam, and he was pretty much the first and only person broadcasting live out of Benghazi. So she became his friend. He got assassinated, by the way. If you look at Stephanie, she then befriended this guy in this chat room, and she spent about 5 days saying, okay, how can I help? I can do a tweet up. I mean, I want to help. I just don't know what I should go do. Well, through a mutual friend, she knew about the Zimbabwe story. So I'm now sitting in Geneva. I'm standing in Geneva Airport, and I get a phone call. Hi, are you Mark? I'm Stephanie. Here's my little background situation. Can you help? I said, absolutely yes. I'm looking for an opportunity to help in Libya, because that sounds like it's a hard thing. So first rule that we're going to follow, Stephanie, is called help others. This is all we're here for, help others. So rather than me saying what needs to be done in Libya, I have no clue, and I'm lazy. So that's another first rule. So I'm really lazy. Our goal is to help others. Can you just ask them what help they need and get back to me? After I go through the security line at Geneva Airport, I get another phone call. Finally, I get a text message first, and then I have to have a phone call. She says, we need an air vac for 50 injured people. Can you help? Like, I don't know what an air vac is, but sure, we can do that. As she was discussing, it was a humanitarian issue. It was a humanitarian tragedy. And what had happened was that somebody had got a plane with a bunch of injured people, and they wanted to fly them out to Benghazi to get medical treatment. How many of you have ever done anything like this before? Okay, I haven't. So then, okay, fine, well, we're lazy. So how would we do this? Well, we need to find out what is the flying distance from Benghazi. So what can be actually flown to? Let's look on the internet, and by the way, these are two civilians, a woman that used to sell Prada shoes and a guy that was a techie and a software guy having a fashion photography studio in Los Angeles. Off the internet, without knowing anybody in Libya, without having any background at all. But so, okay, so you can look at flighttime.com. There's like, you can look at flying distance. And we worked out that Malta would be quite good. Well, if you have 50 people, they'll need to go to a hospital. So you pop into Wikipedia and you find the hospitals in Malta. You then say, well, okay, we probably should call up the person that operates the hospital to see, by the way, is it okay if I have 50 near-dead Libyans to look after? Would you help out? Well, how would you do that? Well, again, you go online, you find the telephone number of the people to speak to, and you just give them a phone call. It was actually that easy. I then thought, well, okay, who do I know in my network that I can activate that actually knows something about this? Because it's not as though everybody is helpful. And I remember that I met at a party in Berlin about 2 weeks before then, a woman who was at UN Disaster Readiness Assessment Center. And so she would pretty much, her team would go in there at the beginning to do this mean stuff. So I saw that she was online on Skype. I'm now sitting in a hotel in London. And I then say, hi, Silver, it's Mark here. Got a kind of a weird question. If I have 50 injured people in a plane in Benghazi, what would you do because you're the expert? She gave me a checklist of things to go do. I, because I'm lazy, gave it to Stephanie. Stephanie gave it to the Libyans. And based on that, in the space of about 25 minutes, we all determined that the plane should never fly. Because part of the first thing on the checklist is who's on the plane. Okay, this was the first interaction. This took place on the 25th of February. Now let's sort of fast forward to some of the sort of future actions, and let's look at pre-existing networks. One of the ways that we realized in Libya that was going on was it's a humanitarian issue. And if the how we can help answer is pretty much we can help by helping with humanitarian aid. From somebody that used to sell $35,000 handbags to Russian mistresses of rich people, and some techie and of me. But it's a humanitarian crisis. But also, we're thinking about, in the future, we need a network. Because with a network, if you activate it, we can do stuff. And so we decided deliberately to tap into the network of Libyan doctors. Because the Libyan doctors know almost everybody. They're quite senior in their communities. They had multiple communication devices. They worked across Libya and they had connections to diaspora around the country. And because it was a humanitarian issue, they were also in direct personal contact with the key people on the rebel side who were trying to sort of manage this thing. Off the live stream website at some point, somebody from a European intelligence service contacted us off the internet to say, hi, we'd like to help out in some way. We can't officially, but we think that you know the National Transitional Council in Libya. So this is the, it's sort of before the UN no-fly zone and before France recognizes the council. Because the Libyans at that time didn't want to have any help. And the intelligence was, no, no, you really do need help. You're about to get totally and utterly slaughtered. But the Libyans, oh no, we don't need any help. No boots on the ground, no help, we're completely fine. They were dreaming. So I'm sitting, and now I'm in New York. Stephanie's in Paris. This person is wherever they are. And we're having a Skype chat where he's giving us pieces of military intelligence. Remember the thing about sort of mushrooms and everything else? So now I'm being told about T-72 Russian tanks that have been reconditioned in Belarus. Well, this is nice because you can go online to Wikipedia, see what a T-72 tank is, find out the price points for getting it reconditioned in Belarus, so you can actually work out in a coffee shop in New York without having any experience in military hardware whatsoever. At the end of this Skype chat, Stephanie and I realized, yeah, okay, we need to help. What we need to do is we need to find the members of the National Transitional Council who nobody knows who they are and share this information. Go through the rules. It's all easy. Let's be lazy. Pre-existing network. So, okay, Stephanie, go to the doctors and ask them. And sure enough, within 3 hours, we had the email addresses, names, satellite phone numbers, everything for the main people in the Transitional Council, and that took a bunch of civilians 3 hours. The British fly a multi-million-dollar helicopter in and all get arrested on the Tuesday. We're able to do stuff. Tactics, tactical application. So to pull things together, and then we just sort of open up for any question. By the way, I promise I can answer any question. Like even when we did start off with the neuroscience of sex, but you shouldn't necessarily go back there again. Because if we just have a look at what we've been describing, and then we open up for debate, we've got a concept of the individual, a concept of the group, and now we have a framework for the masses. And what we're trying to do then with these tools is that hopefully I've given you an indication that we can use these new ways, this new lens of looking at things, to understand what is going on, to understand why Facebook is successful, to understand why our startup venture doesn't seem to be getting any kind of pickup or traction. We can then use it to predict. And there's a whole method that I've been working on something called trajectories, which then looks at almost like an estimation using these tools about what is likely to happen next without any form of intervention. And that gives you a predictive capacity. The Occupy Wall Street movement, which I'm sure you're aware of, I realized that that would be very, very contagious on the 22nd of August. It started on the 17th of September. But part of the reason why is that when I sort of found out about it, I think it was the anonymous Twitter feed had said, we're going to support this. I had a look at the Occupy Wall Street website, and it was designed almost as a sort of potential franchise McDonald's service. It had spreadability. And because it had spreadability, already then a month before it started, you could see that this thing was going to be contagious. That allows you the capabilities of predicting what goes on. But then, if you don't like what the natural occurring outcome is, remember the Libyan example, the naturally occurring outcome before the French recognized the council, was that all of the rebels were about to get murdered. That was what the natural emerging pattern was going to be. Well, okay, then let's design a plan, a program, to do something about it, to change that future. And hopefully, and I partly do the dictatorship stuff, because it is so extreme, it's so out there. It's also public domain stuff that you can go and have a look at. What I hopefully should do is in your minds to give you the thought to say, okay, if it can actually be done for dictatorships, and it really, and by the way, it is as easy as I'm describing it. My goal is to be an idiot. I mean, this is just really simple stuff. Maybe then you can begin to realize and think very deeply that you can also do this within your own organizations, your own startups, and convincing people in your own markets. So with that, I urge you to sort of take this notion of the lens to look at things differently. Wish you luck on your journeys, and now I'm quite happy to take questions. So first of all, thank you very much, and then questions. Thank you. Questions?
Yes, questions. I have a very big question. I was listening to you, and now I know why I think about sex every 20 milliseconds and all the other useful stuff. But can you tell me, what is it to do with entrepreneurship?
What, the sex stuff or the?
No, the whole thing. Okay. What you were
because I can relate it to sex
about. Yes, I know that. But the whole thing, what you were telling about moving the masses. So is it the entrepreneurship about moving the masses, or what's there for entrepreneurship? Well, for entrepreneurs.
So already, if you look at entrepreneurs are deviants. So a deviant is pretty much would be defined as if there's a normal pattern of behavior. Those people that deviate from that standard pattern of behavior are deviants. There's what's called positive deviance, which is then it's a good new method, a good new technique. And what's that? Remember about the sort of clapping thing about who's going to clap next? The thing that an entrepreneur needs to have is that you need to create followership around you. So therefore, as a rule, you need, let's say, a winning team. So you have an idea. How do you persuade some other co-founders to come on board? Because as an entrepreneur, as your sort of positive deviance, you need to start getting that sort of first followership group. If we look at other things of an entrepreneur doing this, most of what you're trying to do is persuasion. How do you persuade people to go do stuff? How do you persuade venture capitalists to give you money? How do you persuade the bank to not foreclose on the loan until you've had a little bit of extra time? How do you persuade customers to go and adopt your product? Well, with these tactics, you can then, as an entrepreneur, become a hell of a lot smarter about how you can actually do your business. I did a project for a Swiss company who was selling to the entertainment industry. and their background was around security systems, and they developed this very big data warehouse for movie studios. And I was working as a consultant on their go-to-market plan, and so helping out the entrepreneur with this sort of new business within this large company. And as we were beginning to use some of the neuroscience stuff, we realized that there are only 6 movie studios. Well, this means then as an entrepreneur, our tactics will be the tactics of convincing a small number of people, not the tactics of convincing a large number of people. They're different blocks of tactics. So now we need to convince a small number of people. When we looked at the entrepreneur's business model, their business model was a repeatable business, so every single movie could be an additional sale. So therefore, you want your customer to want you to come back every single month. We then looked at, well, okay, who is our target market? And this is where most people do not spend enough time. I think probably my sort of primary disappointment or opportunity here within Estonian startups is there's not enough focus paid to marketing, market development, sales. But I'm actually looking forward to partnering with people here to bring this sort of the stuff that I'm showing here into Estonian companies. If we look at this thing then, they needed to persuade 6 movie studios to sort of keep bringing them back in to do sales. Let's go back to the neuroscience of sex. Now, you mentioned like thinking about sex every 20 milliseconds. That would actually put you into the world of deviant. Because that's not it. Males, by the way, if you look at the proportion of the brain devoted to the sex organs, males have 2.5 times more portion of their brains devoted to the sex organs than women. That's just. In addition to that, if you're thinking about men, and you probably will have noticed this, a man is able to see something that is sexy to the man within 20 milliseconds. Conscious thought takes 90 milliseconds. So men are able to find things they find sexy in less time than it takes them to actually think about the stuff that they're even seeing. The reason for this is that when we see through our eyes, it goes to the visual cortex, which is our visual processing engine at the back of our brain. It then filters through to the rest of the brain. The very first thing that that signal sees when it goes through is our sexy pattern recognition engine, which is sitting right next to the visual cortex, which is why we're able to basically see things we find sexy as men before we've even thought about it, or almost sort of, to some extent, even opened our eyes. Let's go back to the entrepreneurship in this situation here, and the reason why you need to think about marketing and your target customer. The people that they were selling to were men between 40 and 55. Unfortunately, in that particular area, it was much more of a male-dominated area. So what we worked out as a concept is that you should have a 2-person selling team with an account manager, relationship manager that was very, very nice, very friendly. Not the person that you're going to get, but in people's heads, the guys' heads, they were thinking, wow, this is Eva, and she's really cute. We'd love to have her back again. If you look at the social dynamic, this guy is sitting there in his office. You actually wanted him in his head to say, you know what? I've invited Eva back to present their new things that they have, because then the other people in my office will see that I can get really, really hot suppliers in. It's a tactic. So these are some of the sort of tactics that entrepreneurs can use. Yes, the question. Yeah.
You want to work on better place, and you're doing it by step, by project. Do you think it's you're doing this idea next 5 years, next 10 years, more, or you want more power to it, more people, more ideas how to make bigger your capabilities? Right now you're doing alone, one by one, step by step. So what will be the next 2 years when you think, do you want to do the same thing as you're doing right now, or do you want to make more power to it, give it more boost?
So I came up with my plan for world change at the end of 2007. And I'm looking at sort of the concept of momentum, and I think in terms of time. So right now, I did the Zimbabwe thing as a small thing because I needed to have a reference model or a test. The Libyan thing became much more aggressive, and I'm actually starting, I've got a TV show that comes out at the beginning of December to start communicating the message. My goal is to help others. How are you supposed in world change, if you have a sort of social mission, how are you supposed to choose between poverty and children with diabetes? How are you supposed to choose between whatever, malaria and HIV? But as a concept, it's as stupid as, imagine if we decided that 7 billion people, we're going to have one blog for the planet, and only one. So let's all sit down and work out who's going to write the blog. That's a stupid idea. Instead, what you do is you create templates and models so that the techniques can be applied over and over again, almost in terms of like a fractal nature. So what I'm actually doing, like the current stage that I'm at now, is now going out to package up the content, and this thing is recorded. We'll get it transcribed. We'll then put it into different languages. The content can then be massively shared at a huge amount of scale so that more people can find out that there is another way of doing things. This then creates new Spark models, like sort of for new models for people to go follow. And that will then help then apply these tactics into many, many different areas all at the same time. So yeah, so my concept then is like massive scale, and this then is one piece of the journey on that thing, but in a very deliberate way. And you had a...
Have you think about it? Because now you're talking, yes, I can manage to get more 100,000 people, even 5 million, maybe 10. But that's not the idea, because the idea is to give to the first idea more boost. So it doesn't change. But now you're like getting bigger, but at the same time you're doing one step by step the projects. Actually, the idea is not being it's actually going down, because it's going to be less idea, more about spreading.
So my concept is actually sort of slightly different.
It's going like an egg on the floor and it's less spreading.
So I'm really cunning, but I'm an idiot in many, many areas, but this one particular area I'm really, really good. And so the reason why I say this then is that, so my goal is to help others. So right now I spend a lot of times with non-profits, people with movements, missions and everything else, to spend the 10 minutes, half an hour, 45 minutes with them to help them scale and spread their good things. So right now then I'm working out how do I effectively clone myself. So how do I take the content out of this head? I mean, I could be dead. It was actually working with Arthur in Zimbabwe who taught me like sort of not to be so worried about being dead. Because, I mean, he actually had a physical chance of being murdered every 6 months out, like 50-50 chance. And I asked him, like, okay, how on earth, and in Libya, I mean, Mohammed Nabuz, he was killed. So right now, I mean, I asked him, like, I mean, how on earth do you do this? He goes, well, I don't really have a choice. And if I'm dead, I'm dead. When you're dead, I mean, I personally believe that when you're dead, life ends. The whole world ends, because you live your life entirely through your own eyes. And yet my goal is to help others. The only way that I can help others goes back to that sort of MIT courseware. Write once, share everywhere, so that the models can be replicated over and over and over again, and they keep developing new things. So you will continue to see more and more of this stuff spreading dramatically. And if we look at the sort of how idiotic it was with the mushrooms and not having access to a book starting with the letter M, the way that things work with the internet is that this video may get anywhere from 10 people seeing it to 100,000 people seeing it, instantly getting the same message at exactly the same time. So there are then ways of spreading these things dramatically, but it's then just sort of built into the model. Have a good question, yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah? No? I have, of course, questions. But it's not so traditional to think in terms of starting sharing your ideas. What you said, that drop your message to one network and talk about what you want actually for as many people as possible. It's not so typical to think about this way in business, because we in a way afraid to lose our competitive advantage. Today you have competitive advantage. You know something which maybe most of the people don't know, or at least they don't know the way you know, and yet you're telling about spreading the word, and you're okay if all the people in the room would use your method to do their business. Isn't that contradictory in business?
So if you look at, there are some notions of logic in this. So first of all, there is a demographic change that is taking place. A demographic block is between 18 and 20 years. It's the time up to adulthood. And if you look at the current block of people that are hitting 26 years old, they fundamentally think differently about sharing than somebody that is between 27 and 46. Fundamentally. I'll give you an example. If you look at having a camera. So right now, I had the very first sort of Sony DSC-1 Cybershot camera. I bought this thing when I was, I don't know, 17, 18, like 20 years ago. All the pictures came out yellow. It was crap, but it was digital. And every 6 months, I would download things onto my hard drive, and I might once a year make a CD. Now, on the other hand, I mean, some people here have been taking pictures, immediately uploading it to the internet, and if you share it on Flickr, you're sharing it with millions and millions of strangers. That notion of sharing, or whether it's private data experiences right now, has fundamentally changed within that generational block. Fundamentally changed. And so right now, then, there are old-style entrepreneurs that would then not share. The thing is, though, the future is driven by the people at the youngest bottom that are entering into the workforce. And so right now, if they want to share, so me as an entrepreneur and I don't want to share anything, I will get my ass whipped by people that are actually willing to share. The next thing, though, is that you shouldn't be an idiot. So right now, I'm sharing lots of stuff with you. I'm not sharing everything with you. I've got 200 pieces. I'm only giving you the bit that teases you and thinks, wow, this stuff is really cool. I'm certainly not going to give you the secret sauce to allow you to set up in business to compete against me. You will have the breadcrumbs to allow yourself to go down that route, but there's no way that you could replicate it. The other logic in my head is to say, I make my money out of selling services to very large corporations. I don't make money out of startups. So therefore, I'm quite happy to share my stuff with you guys in this particular way, and on the internet as well, because right now then there's almost, if you like, a different way of engaging with a small number of large customers to solve their large company needs. It's almost the entrepreneur has to have a more sort of sensible and sensitive way of thinking about their business. Because one of the things that I have noticed with entrepreneurs now is that quite often you don't want to share, and I've had a lot of conversation with entrepreneurs about how there's nothing like their stuff on the market. And as soon as anybody says that, while I'm talking to them, I do a Google search for what it is that they supposedly do, and I find 4 companies in the space of 40 seconds that do the stuff that they do. So I'm like, okay, were you aware of these people? Well, I was aware of one, but okay, you're about to basically give up your life, raise money, employ people, and you can't be bothered to do a fucking Google search? Laziness. But so right now then, I think the other thing is sharing is that if you do not share, you do not get the ability for having other people to help you. So if you're doing something completely in secret, it may be that the person right next door to you can really, really help. But if you don't share it, they can never help. You actually are sort of hurting yourself by not sharing. Now, at the same time, then, there are different ways of sharing. You might not want to go to an industry conference to speak to your biggest competitor to share the stuff that you're working on. You might, though, within your network, have entrepreneurs working in a different area that you want to go share. You might share with taxi drivers. You might share with people that you meet on a bus. The thing is, you still have to share the stuff. The tricky thing that we're now working in is that what we are now sharing can then immediately be videotaped, uploaded to the net, and shared and stored forever. So now actually, our ability to then sort of control how sharing works is also totally and utterly disintegrating. And that we'll see that disintegration happen in a sort of benign way over the next sort of 2 to 4 years, because then when you're shared, everything can be copied. But that's a good thing. So, other questions?
Yeah. So anybody? Yep. I will give you a mic.
Thank you. You like to talk about gender differences and what's the difference between men and women and how they differently behave. I want to build a bridge to entrepreneurship. Usually in startup events or entrepreneur events, it's especially in the tech area, it's mostly guys there. And we know from science that women are more likely to invest or employ people who are similar to themselves. So venture capitalists tend to be like a middle-aged white man. So I'm a young lady. I have an idea. What recommendation would you give me to kind of compete in such a world?
This is a, when I look at sort of my businesses, I mean, right now I'm fed up of working with lots of men. It's just they're testosterone driven, they get an, so right now we need to have balance. So I think then, if one is to be, I mean, I think partially you've got to almost think sort of pragmatically and tactically versus sort of a vision of change. Now, it's worthwhile looking back at history. So already it was only in about 1920 that women were given the right to vote in most countries. And in fact, in Switzerland, women were only given the right to vote in 1975. So it's not as though there are countries with hundreds of years of tradition of being nice to women. In fact, most countries are being absolutely mean as hell, and it's not fair. I think then what it is, though, looking at doing is that to still look at sort of the merits of your idea and how to present it, and actually ignoring the fact that you are a woman. Because as soon as one then begins to start working on that piece as a gender, you then begin to forget about the merit of your idea and actually almost saying, well, okay, I'm a woman, I'm struggling to get this thing forward. Now, the same applies for minorities, but it's sort of people who've got less language skills. But now there was a tactic, what I would suggest, is that there are these sort of tactics and methods to actually sort of really do stuff. The first thing is to work out what is your end goal. So now that you've decided, okay, this is what I want. So let's say in your case as an entrepreneur, your goal is not to be nice to VCs. Your goal is to raise €1 million to have a company that does this. That's your end goal. And then you begin to map out, well, what is the current situation? Who do I know? What networks can I tap into the current situation? Then you work out, well, okay, over time, how do I then progress my way there? And then you quite systematically go execute to get to your end goal. And I think then what happens is that it's very tempting to get stuck on a middle goal, and it's very tempting to, let's say, sort of fall back on your, whatever the sort of perceived personal weaknesses that you have. But by starting off with this end goal thing and looking at your situation analysis, you're able to quite simply then work out, well, okay, let's ignore the fact that I'm a woman, but well, actually what's needed is that right now I need to have a team of 3 people with me. And so therefore, right now, the reason why I was being, let's say, rejected from a meeting was not that I was a woman, but it was actually because I didn't have a team. So if that's my issue, now I will have a team together, and now we can present as a group. So they're just sort of very practical ways of doing things. And by the way, I should also say, don't believe that everything that I say is right. You have to go down your own journey. I'm one person with an opinion, and I get to have a microphone. You, on the other hand, you have to lead your own lives. You will have your own particular ways of doing things. Some of the stuff that I said you will disagree with. Some of the stuff that I said will be wrong. Some will be found out to be different than you. So don't follow me. Like when I go to the toilet, don't follow me. But at the same time, then hopefully we'll just sort of open our eyes. But good question, yes.
Yeah, exactly about this thing, because I tend not to be agree with you, or at least the area I'm working, Garage 48, prototype within 48 hours, we hate business schools, and so on. And you, in a way, suggest to go to study neuroscience to get your startup going, because in this way you understand the masses and how it works. So if I'm a wannabe entrepreneur, I want to make my first steps. Which way I should take then to go to the business school to study all this smart thing what you were talking about here today, or do the Garage 48 thing, forget the business school and go. Valley, everything, money, VCs, angels.
So, I'm not suggesting learn neuroscience. You can get the type of information I know about neuroscience. You can basically get 3 books, read it on your iPad Kindle, and just read the stuff and remember it. Or read a single newspaper article. Because what you're doing is that you don't have to know how an MRI machine works to pull out and extract the things that are useful. What I'm looking at is how do you persuade a small number or a large number of people to go do stuff, which is a deep entrepreneurial skill. I think, though, if you do look at entrepreneurship, it's interesting that you've got sort of 2 phases of being an entrepreneur. One is this ideation, the creation phase, and the other one is scale-up and execution. And I think if you look at the ability to sort of create these ideas and concepts, quite often it is much more of the sort of Garage 48 method of actually doing something tangibly, physically to get something done. The thing is that piece of entrepreneurship is kind of sexy. It's exciting. You get distracted, though. You focus on a product or a technology, but you forget that you need to market it. You forget that when you need to grow, you forget that you need to hire the right people for your business, and instead you end up employing 3 people that used to work at Nokia, and you think, well, because they worked at Nokia, they'll be a great fit for me. Without realizing that you, as a 10-person startup, this person was in a 5,000-person business unit and used to having a €10 million budget, and now he's pretty much got to sort of work on without even a desk. So right now, then, what happens is that when entrepreneurs move into the scale-up phase, they pretty much have to actually learn a new set of skills. And one of my recommendations for the Garage 48 is to then come up with almost sort of new formats for this sort of immersive learning experience that actually then teach you about the next phase. Developing your business model. The next phase, developing your organization, so you can use the same deep, immersive, community-based experience to help learn more. Business school does not give you any magic formula, and most business school people that sort of, I created my first business out of business school, and I pretty much went bankrupt in 7 months. Because what they didn't teach me at business school was cash flow, which is that if you don't have any more money left, you go bust. They didn't teach me that. I mean, they're like sort of, you can make this huge, giant analysis, but they didn't teach me the basics. But so, I mean, I think there was a lot to be said for just sort of rolling up your sleeves and getting stuff done. But I think then at the same time, having a good advisory group, sense checking, and using the internet to find out what other people have done. Because I think this is another thing that you'll have. This country doesn't have very many people. There aren't that many people to go to and ask for advice. The planet, though, has 7 billion people, and a whole bunch of people are doing the stuff that you would like to go do. Use the sodding internet to type in whatever the question is. I mean, my goal is to be lazy. As soon as I have a question that I don't know, I go to the internet and I type it in as a question. And usually, within anywhere between 2 and 4 minutes, I get answers that at least tell me but the key thing there is actually social adoption of technology. Because we have the tools, we have the technology, but right now we're not yet at the stage, but we will get there very quickly, that we remember to use it all of the time. For example, now it could easily have been that when I said dopamine, somebody could have just been typing in their iPhone to pull out dopamine and then ask a question on it. We can do that. But right now we're looking at basically a change in the social adoption of this technology, and we'll be using these tactics of spread to have adoption being used more and more, so that we can actually be as smart as the smartest person on the planet at any second. And that certainly applies to you guys as entrepreneurs doing it. But so yes, I wouldn't go one way or the other. I'm much more emergent. Who am I to say what is right or wrong? I'm not. I wouldn't even begin to.
By the way, we are using Skype instead of Nokia example.
Yeah, but it would be.
Yeah.
I've got a very basic question. You're talking about the scientific solution for betterment of humankind. On the other hand, if we look at history, and nation states that have used science as a method to better mankind, there have been awful, awful results. Do you have some backup plan?
Well, so a few different things. I mean, by and large, if one looks at the application of science, the vast majority of the applications of science have been good. Vast majority. So right now, the goodness massively outweighs the bad, but sometimes the bad, I mean, the sort of atom bomb type of thing, would then neglect. I mean, right now, I'm 41. I'll be alive for another 50 years. 100 years ago, I'm a dead man. Science helped out for that. So there's actually, so I'm like sort of partially you have to have a sort of, there's a much more positive view. But then if you look at it, so whenever you make a change, there will be unintended consequences. So therefore, you've always got to work out when you sort of start making a change program, what are the bad things that could happen? And in fact, for about 1 year as I was developing my science of spread, I realized that these tactics can be used by evil people to do evil. I then realized that a lot of the tactics that I've developed come from history and come from the evil people. Because the evil people had some bloody good tactics. For example, when Stalin was sort of invading Poland beginning of the Second World War, he captured the 20,000 of the Polish elite. It's a tactic pretty much, you take out the sort of control structure at the top and you either kill them, do something bad to them, as a reference model to the others. And one of the things that he had his men do before he actually had everybody murdered was something that was touching, that is sort of feels like deeply human, is that he allowed them all to send letters back to their families to say a final goodbye. So that he could trace every single letter to find out where the families were so that he could kill them and stick them in the sort of the gulags. It's a tactic. Well, now, though, what is very interesting is that, first of all, if you're trying to do good in the world, you will be fighting bad people at some point, potentially. So you need to know how they operate. The next thing is that if we can then sort of disassociate ourselves from the value of what it is that they're doing, but look at the tactics, some of those tactics are tremendously powerful to be used for good and for scale. So right now, for example, I'd mentioned this sort of email, that you should have a viral spread component to your email. That was based on me looking at how Stalin did the Polish elite. I think then finally, if we do look at science, though, I actually believe that in the next 2 to 4 years, we will see fundamental changes in core science across every single discipline that will dramatically accelerate sort of humankind's sort of understanding of science and new inventions. It'll be dramatic. Same way in 110 years ago, human beings worked out how to record the human voice. We've been on the planet for 100,000 years. It's basically in the last fraction of a second that we've become even semi-intelligent. Part of the things that happens is that at the moment with the capitalist system, you put $100 million into clean tech, one company gets 500 million, another company gets 250, and the rest get little pieces. But all of these scientists, all working on exactly the same problem, are encouraged not to share anything. What's happening, though, is that now the younger generation have grown up sharing. You'll communicate probably more with the people that you went to college with than the people sometimes in your own company. You get faster responses. There's also huge youth unemployment. So right now in Spain, there's 45% youth unemployment. So you have a whole bunch of people with good educations, with internet access, that are just looking for stuff to go do. So actually, in addition to that, if one looks at science, most of the times when we've had scientific breakthroughs, it actually turns out in the spread of that breakthrough that there was a period of time when the breakthrough was known, but for whatever reason, it took 10 years to actually get out. And if we look at the reasons why, it pretty much is a form of the dictatorship structure. If one looks at black holes, there was sort of the world's top astronomer. They were the most successful person. They're the ones that control the research grants. They're the ones that decide, I bless you and I don't like you. When an Indian guy came up with the concept of black holes and wanted to present, this best astronomer in the world said, you know what, I'll help you. I'll help you. So give me your paper, I'll review it, and I'll tell you what, I'll get you presenting at my sort of society, and I'll present after you. And this Indian chap thought, this is fantastic, without, of course, realizing the guy was a racist, didn't like Indians, and wanted to pretty much destroy the person as a tactic. And so this man, as a dictator, the top scientist of his time, deliberately let this guy present and then destroyed him. So that it took 10 years, or pretty much almost waiting until the dictator of that area was dead, until science could move on. If one looks by and large at what we're seeing in science, or breakthroughs, is that you have a very small, it's a control structure where you have a very small number of people that determine what is good or bad. They're the ones that determine this gets funded, this does not get funded, and it's based on the sort of personal preferences of a small number of individuals. What's happening, though, with transparency, with the power of the masses, our ability to connect, is that these people are finding it harder and harder to hide. And I think we're going to see a huge explosion in the amount of connections that we have between people, which means that those individual pinch points will all of a sudden start dramatically losing relevance. So now then we can actually begin to push the sciences forward where the breakthroughs have already taken place, but for some reason I'll give 15 million to this big building and I'll give nothing to the person that actually has the idea that will make a difference. I believe fundamentally we will see that change in the next 2 to 4 years, and it's already happening now. So more positive.
Okay, very good. More hands.
How do you think the intellectual property system of the whole world would have to change to allow more interconnected working and progress in the innovation generally?
Right now, as a structure, these things are breaking. I mean, there are just certain types of structures that snap. I was speaking to somebody about the 26,000 patents that go into every single mobile phone, and how organizations owning lots of patents are becoming much more bullying and licensing and everything else. The thing is that knowledge wants to spread. And before it was possible with the sort of things like a patenting system to control how information was flowed fairly well, so you can control how it's used. However, the ability to scale and spread stuff now is really quick. I don't know what the answer is about what a new form of intellectual property system will look like. But right now, the patenting system that exists is beginning to run out of headroom. It's beginning to start breaking, because most of the things that we're developing need to have ideas, insights, pieces from lots and lots of other people. I think in addition to that, because of the sort of greed or capitalist notion, there are then some people that have realized that these patents are control points. And very often a patent portfolio is used to prevent innovation from taking place in your industry. So right now, but then the final thing is that we're global. So all it takes is for one big country to not give a damn. Now all of a sudden means that America builds their walled garden, Europe builds their walled garden, but the people in Brazil, India, and China don't. And so right now what it means then is you end up with a period of time in a system where you have almost sort of openness, sharing, desire to create, and a control system that exists, and then it's almost as though, is there a train wreck, does it synthesize together as how it develops? I don't have the answer. I don't know how it's going to work yet. I haven't really sort of spent time figuring out what is likely to happen. But you do see that as knowledge begins to spread, it's starting to spread anyway, even if you can't control the commercial piece, but it's spreading anyway. So then it's going to be a case of then how do you control value? But I think the other, from an entrepreneurial perspective, is that a patent does not make you money. Even if you have a patent, you need to license it, which means you need to have a team to go out that do licensing. So I think then, to some extent, when people have thought about intellectual property, we've thought about it in quite a sort of linear, sort of narrow fashion. And I think then as people begin to explore how they're using intellectual property, we'll have much more of a multifaceted, richer understanding of how it works, because there are different ways of making money than just the license of the patent. But yeah, I mean, if you have some ideas in that, I'd love to spend some time, figure out how to have the next version.
The patent question was good, because I have heard that there's a lot of madness in the States within medicine and technology. So what I see is like a credit crisis. Everyone owns everyone. So everyone holds everyone else's patents. So in some point there should be some collapse or something to happen from the chaos.
Well, and the patenting system is less than 100 years old. Corporations are about 150 years old. What happens as human beings is that we take today what we see and we extrapolate this thing as lasting forever without reading history books. This stuff is new. I've been reading the history of marriage, and marriage as a monogamous concept has existed for about 150 years. It was a new concept, it got adopted, fairly well widespread. But these things that are concepts that we think are going to be there forever sometimes have only existed a fraction of a second. Mobile phones didn't exist 30 years ago. The internet didn't exist. Right now we're then seeing that the internet of what we see today, and we think that the present will go on forever. But it's mistaken thinking, and all you have to do is open a simple history book and you can see how wrong we have been in the past. But so right now, then you are likely to see dramatic changes in these things as to how long they take. Some breakthroughs take about 10 years to start percolating through. But we begin to then see demographic logics, connection logics, then force change to be made, whether people like it or not.
Let's take a final question, because one word what I remember from your presentation is tactics, and another word is networking, and the useful of good network. So I would like to actually give you now the chance to go for a lunch and to start networking. So the person who eats less wins, because that means that they're talking more. So thank you, Mark.
Oh no, thank you. Thank
for
you
this amazing presentation. So 3 things. What do you want, the time frame, and tell as many people as possible. This you can already realize today, just in a minute during the lunch break. Have a good lunch.
Very good, thank you.